Hello, everyone. My name is Connor Shear, and my project was on isometric and isotonic exercises and how they affect an athlete who is diagnosed with patellar tendinopathy. Patellar tendinopathy is often referred to as PT. It is a specific pain that originates in the lower portion of the patellar tendon. It's usually associated with energy when energy is stored or released in the tendon. So tendinopathy is tiny tears in the tendon over time. Some symptoms include pain or tenderness, as well as discomfort at the base of the kneecap, along with swelling. So it can be caused by uneven leg strength, hard playing surfaces, repeated landings. These are a few causes for patellar tendinopathy. One of the main mechanics that is associated with patellar tendinopathy in athletes is landing technique. As an athlete jumps in basketball or volleyball, the force that is produced when the athlete interacts with the ground, it has nowhere to disperse because the court is so hard, so that force is then distributed and absorbed by the patellar tendon, which can then damage the tendon and cause patellar tendinopathy. Patellar tendinopathy can affect the athlete not only in their playing, but it can affect them in their normal activities and their daily living. One study said that landing can put anywhere from 3 to 12 times the amount of force of the athlete's body weight onto the patellar tendon. And running itself can put up to 5 times. So it's more likely for athletes who are volleyball, basketball, these type athletes that have high jumping and heavy landing and loading onto the patellar tendon. It can also in the daily living, even walking upstairs can be painful to that athlete. So in the studies, they used isometric and isotonic contractions to stimulate the muscle to try to get a benefit. An isometric contraction is where the muscle length stays the same while tension is increased. So the muscle never actually moves, or the fulcrum never moves, but the muscle is activating. So there's little to no movement. We don't want, when conducting an isometric exercise, you don't want the participant to be fully contracting and relaxing that arm. With the isotonic exercise, the muscle contracts and shortens while tension is increased. So for this exercise, the athlete is actually fully contracting the muscle and experiencing the full range of motion while they are contracting the muscle. So in the studies, there were specific athletes that were used. The sports that were used for these specific studies were mainly volleyball and basketball. There were a few other sports that were listed, but for the main portion of all of the studies, it was mainly volleyball and basketball. All of the athletes were in college or were elite athletes. There were a few studies that studied samples from high school and younger athletes. In particular, they were basketball players, and there were a few high school volleyball players that were in the studies. All of the participants were clinically diagnosed by an expert physician. So they had an expert physician come in and examine the patellar tendons, and they would use x-rays or different modalities to check the patellar tendon. For the clinical findings of these studies, many of the studies examined the effects of the exercises on the athlete with patellar tendinopathy. Some looked at the mechanisms behind the patterns that the athletes developed by having PT. Many of the athletes showed signs of changed biomechanical techniques in order to distribute the energy in different ways to cause less pain to the patellar tendon. And one study that I reviewed looked at neurotransmitters released during the absorption phase upon in the athlete that was landing, that was diagnosed with the patellar tendinopathy. Many methods were used. I believe there was 2 or 3 methods that were used. But for the most part, since there were mainly small studies, a single blind crossover trial was used. So the participants were given a exercise, not told what it was meant to do, and then they would do that exercise, and then later they might be told to do a different exercise and not be told the benefits, but perform these exercises. The studies lasted anywhere from 4 weeks to 12 weeks, 12 weeks being the longest. For the studies, they would just about all of the studies tested all the studies tested the patients at baseline at 0 weeks, and then every week or at the very end of the study trial, they would do another examination of the pain related to the athlete's patellar tendinopathy. The test that was used to determine the amount of pain in the athletes was the single leg decline squat. So that was the test that was used most commonly in just about all of the studies that I reviewed. It's believed to give the best determination of pain in athletes and people that have patellar tendinopathy. So they were also asked on the Victorian Institute of Sports Assessment, or the VISA questionnaire, on how they would score their ability and pain in normal everyday activities, such as walking upstairs, walking into the kitchen, stepping down somewhere. Just multiple questions like this that ask the participant how they live in normal life. So for the isometric exercise, they performed a isometric contraction at about 70 to 80% of their maximal voluntary contraction, and they were at a 60-degree knee flexion. So they performed 5 sets of 45-second long leg extension holds. And there was pain reduction because of the isometric contraction. So the isotonic contraction, they used 4 sets of 8 repetitions of 80 to 100% of the maximum weight that the participant can do on the leg extension press or leg extension machine. And there was a slower amount of pain reduction in the isometric exercise, but there was still pain reduction, and it wasn't as great as the isometric exercise. So the isometric exercise actually showed that it had sustained pain reduction for at least 45 minutes after the exercise was conducted. And it improved the motor functions of the tendon and of the muscles around. And it also did not cause damage to the patellar tendon. And it also produced higher muscle fiber activation. So the muscle fibers around the patellar tendon were firing more and had more ability to increase in size and strength. So for the isotonic contraction, there was immediate pain reduction, but it was not sustained for the 45 minutes. It did improve the function, and it showed similar effects to the isometric exercise, just not that sustained benefit for the pain reduction. So the results in short term, or the result showed short term pain reduction. The isometric exercise actually worked a little bit better. We have a graph here that shows the pain reduction from the isometric and isotonic. So the isometric here, you can see that their pain was all high. It declines immediately following the exercise, and then 45 minutes after, it also is very low. And then for the isotonic, it shows some pain reduction, but then at that 45 minutes, it goes back up. So it also helped the motor neuron activity. So it was activating all of the muscle fibers around the patellar tendon and strengthening those and increasing the cortical inhibitors, which the studies believe that the effects on the short interval cortical inhibitors and the motor neuron activity play a part in the pain reduction. So the results from a Norwegian study examined exercise apoptosis in PT athletes, and the study compared biopsy specimens from patellar tendons with PT and without. So pretty much they determined that cell death can be caused by PT, but if it's used with isometric exercise, it can actually be reduced in athletes with PT. And one study that was conducted by Ebony Rio, who's a leading researcher in the field, examined if isometric exercise could induce analgesia and reduce inhibition. It was found that the isometric contraction reduced the pain from the PT and increased the maximum voluntary contraction for at least 45 minutes after the exercise. The isometric contraction could be completed without pain, and most of the other studies found the same finding. Another study I found examined the effects of taping on the patellar tendon, and it used a diamond shape around the patella to reduce the amount of force that was applied to the patellar tendon during loading and landing, and it was found that it didn't do that much for the landing forces.